Did you know that the 4G63 actually belongs to a Mitsubishi family of engines known as the Sirius family? And that's a real fitting name because these sure are some serious engines. Nothing? No? So how do you know an engine is good? You know an engine is good when it powers 9 generations of a really good, really successful sports car over a period of 15 years. You know an engine is good when the 10th generation of that sports car gets a different, more modern engine and everybody goes, ugh, because they want the old one. They didn't get sick of it for 9 generations. I mean, if that doesn't make an engine good, nothing does. But if you think that the 4G63 began with the Lancer Evolution, you're wrong. If you think it's been on the market for some 20 odd years, because that's what everybody says when you ask them, you know, the 4G63 has been around for more than 20 years, it's a really old engine. No, it's been around for 38 years. And in a few months, that's gonna be 39 years, because it's still being produced and installed in cars today. Although, but we're gonna talk more about later. Now, what was I gonna say? The first car that had a 4G63 in it, a turbo one. The natural aspirated stuff is good too, but the turbo is what it's all about, so we're talking about the turbo today. The first car that had a 4G63 turbo in it wasn't a Lancer Evolution, it was this. And this is the Mitsubishi Lancer EX 2000 Turbo. And it's the first car to have a genuine 2-liter 4G63 turbo in it. And it's from 1981. 81, my people. I mean, that's almost 39 years ago. I mean, the 4G63 is older than the entire YouTube viewing population combined. As you might be able to tell already, this car is a real warrior in super boring office clothing. And already in this car, we can see a lot of the EVO recipe. It was a boring looking 4-door sedan that would kick sports car ass. Let's compare it to a typical competitor from its era. The BMW 323i, it made 143 horsepower. The Lancer EX 2000 Turbo made 170 horsepower, so it would blow the BMW out of the water. Now you're probably saying, 170 horsepower, my GSM Talon makes 7 million. Yeah, I mean, this thing was capable of big power right from the get-go. The EX 2000 Turbo, I'm gonna have to shorten this, was entered in the 1000 Lakes Rally. And already here at the very beginning of the 80s, the 4G63 made 280 horsepower in the 1000 Lakes Rally. So as you can see, the 4G63 kinda kicked ass from day one. And after the EX 2000 Turbo, it went on to power a whole laundry list of different vehicles. Some of which are really interesting. For example, this thing, which is the ultimate dad car. And brace yourself for the name, it's called the Mitsubishi Chariot Resort Runner GT. It's the car dream of every 80s dad. This thing, Kim Basinger, 2 80s brats. Speaking of naming cars, it seems that Mitsubishi actually hired a bunch of 12-year-olds and told them, you know, whatever you feel like from the heart, just name the cars. And because the 4G63 can be found in stuff like the Mitsubishi Mighty Max, the Mitsubishi Airtrek, and of course, who could forget the DSM comic book trio, the Eagle Talon, the Plymouth Laser, and the Eclipse. And as we said, the 4G63 is still being installed in cars today. Sadly, it's cars like the Zotye SR9. Looks kind of familiar, doesn't it? Or how about the Zotye T700? Until just 2 years ago, it was also installed in the Landwind X7. Another really original design. But here's one to top it all off. The 4G63 is still being installed today in turbo form into the Beijing BJ, I'm gonna repeat that, BJ 2022 Brave Warrior. It looks like those 12-year-olds from Mitsubishi's naming department got another employment opportunity in Beijing. Something that might be called the real, or at least the most integral part of the 4G63's history, of course, began in 1992 with the first generation of the Lancer EVO. And unfortunately, the real 4G63 ended in 2007 with the 9th generation of the EVO.
Mitsubishi のエースドライバーは2年連続ドライバーズタイトルに輝いたトミー・マキネン。そしてこのステージで驚異のスーパーラップを見せたのがマキネンのランサー。2位のフォード関9年に。
So what does 4G63 even stand for? I'm sorry Mitsu, but Toyota's naming system is kind of better because look, 4 is the number of cylinders, G is gasoline, 6 is the engine family, that tells you nothing. Number 3 is the position of that particular engine within the engine family, again tells you nothing until you know of all the other engines in the engine family. For example, in the 4G6 we have the 4G61, the 4G62 and the 4G64 alongside with the 4G63. So yeah, until you know all of them, you know nothing. Now the 4G6 family was always Mitsubishi's most performance-oriented engine family, and that makes sense only when you step back and look all of the other Mitsubishi engine families. And when we're talking about the engine families, Mitsubishi also said, you know, since we have kids naming our cars, let's hire a total astronomy weirdo and get him to name our engine families. And the result was this. These are the Mitsubishi engine families. The Saturn, the Orion, the Astron, the Sirius, and the long dead Neptune. As you can see, the 4G6 or the Sirius engine family is the middleweight. The big engines, the bigger ones, were used to power, you know, industrial vehicles, trucks, or whatever else, and the smaller ones were used for more economy-oriented and smaller cars. Now, jokes aside, if you want to know the real reason why there's so much astrology within Mitsubishi's naming system, even the cars have star-related names, for example, the Colt. The deal is that when Mitsubishi was hitting the market, they were aiming for the stars. This was their official, you know, policy, and they wanted to be one of the greatest car manufacturers in the world, so they wanted to be associated with the stars. When it comes to the specs, you will see that the 4G63 ticks all the right boxes. And that explains why it was so good for so long and why it's still relevant today if you want to build a high horsepower compact engine. The 4G63 is just 2 liters and 4 cylinders, and it can get you 1000 horsepower with enough money. Now, let's start with the specs. The 4G63 is actually a slightly under square engine design. We have an engine bore of 85mm and a stroke of 88mm. This partially explains why the 4G63 generates so much torque, but isn't quite as rev-happy as some of its engine competitors. Just like any other famous indestructible engine from the 80s and 90s, the 4G63 uses a cast iron block with a closed deck design. and boy does this one have a lot of cast iron in it. They melted a mountain and cast it into a 4G63. All you have is tiny oil and coolant passages, and the rest is cast iron everywhere. The block can take more boost than you'll ever have money to generate. The internals are super beefy and famous for being able to withstand a lot of boost and a lot of abuse. Just like any engine that's serious about its performance, the 4G63 has a forged steel fully counterweight crankshaft. The rods are also forged on all 4G63 EVO engines, but not necessarily on every 4G63 out there. The pistons are cast, but don't let that make you think they're weak. We're going to talk more about the pistons in the tuning section of this video in just a few moments. The early 4G63s had a compression ratio of 7.8, and this was later increased in later generations to 8.5. We'll also talk about that in the tuning section. Moving on to the cylinder head. The cylinder head is also good, and as we know, it's a dual overhead camshaft design with 16 valves and both of the cam gears driven by a rubber belt. The combustion chambers have a typical closed pentooth design, and inside the combustion chamber we can find some nice valve sizes with 34mm intake valves and 30.5mm exhaust valves. Now, the 4G63 has been around for a very long time, and of course during that time it received numerous revisions, alterations, tweaks, different turbos, special edition titanium compressor turbo wheels, and what have you. Listing all of that in one video would make it a 3-hour video and nobody would watch that. So I'm gonna give you, for a quick reference here, something useful I found online, which is a quick little table comparing all the little differences between the early 1G 4G63s and the later 2G 4G63s. You're welcome. Now, Mitsubishi always wanted the 4G63 to be smooth. It wanted to impress people with how powerful this engine is, but it also wanted to impress people by the fact that it's silent and smooth and doesn't make any of the nasty noises and vibrations a typical 4-cylinder makes. And this is why Mitsubishi put in the block of the 4G63 two balancing shafts. These things spin along with the crankshaft and they absorb all the typical noise, vibrations and harshness of a 4-cylinder. Up in the cylinder head, we have some hydraulic valve lifters. Now, this means that the 4G63 doesn't require any sort of valve lash adjustment, but more importantly for Mitsubishi, it means that they are more quiet than your typical solid valve lifter, and you won't hear a 4G63 making those loud rattling or ticking noises at idle as a solid valve lifter engine might. Another thing that the later generations of the 4G63 came with is MIVEC. I don't know how you pronounce that. MIVEC, who cares? What it is, it's basically like Honda's VTEC, and it gives the engine multiple cam profiles. This of course was a good thing as it increased efficiency, load and drivability and performance. MIVEC kicked in, yo! It just doesn't sound right, doesn't it? When tuning the 4G63, you can also capitalize on the fact that it was around for a very long time, and during that time it had a bunch of different little changes and a bunch of different little versions, so you can actually mix and match parts to create a hybrid that's perfect for your needs. Now, there's a general conclusion, a general observation we can make if we look at the entire production run of the 4G63. The early versions were super beefy. They had pretty low compression. Their rotating assembly was heavy and didn't like to rotate that much. As time moved on, Mitsubishi sort of decided to change its approach to the 4G63 and wanted to improve the throttle response. It wanted to increase the compression ratio. It wanted to make the rotating assembly lighter, and it did. And the newer the 4G63, likely it's gonna have better throttle response and it's gonna be more drivable in the low end and it's gonna be better off boost. So if you want to build something with high peak horsepower, something that's gonna kick ass on the drag strip, probably gonna be interested in the earlier super beefy stuff. If you want to build something that's awesome, you know, on the street, on a hill climb event, on the track, you want the stuff that's more throttle responsive and has better compression ratio and so on and so forth. A really common hybrid of internals is early rods and later pistons, because this gives you a sort of a nice compromise of beefiness and better compression ratio and better driving of boost, and it's sort of the best of both worlds. So what are the limits of the stock internals of the 4G63? Well, the stock internals are really good, regardless of which generation you take into account. They're really good and they can take a lot of boost. The people that tune the 4G63 and blow the stock internals and they say, you know, the stock internals are bad, I should have gotten forged stuff. No. The stock internals are good. Your tuning is bad. Some people tune this thing and they mess with the ignition timing and they crank up the boost and they have zero knock monitoring, zero knock control, and the engine blows. Of course it's gonna blow. A cast piston doesn't like knock. Even a forged piston doesn't like knock. It can just survive it for a longer time. And knock is what kills the stock internals in 99% of the cases. So if you're doing your tuning right, 400 horsepower on stock internals can be done pretty easily. And the stock internals are gonna take it. People build engines with 400 wheel horsepower on stock internals all day long, all around the world. When it comes to the 4G63, some even build them up to 500 horsepower, although I'm pretty sure reliability and drivability is gonna start falling off right around the 500 horsepower mark. And if you want to go 500 horsepower and beyond, I think that's when you should consider changing out the stock internals for all the cool forged stuff that's available on the 4G63 aftermarket. And the 4G63 has an amazing aftermarket. There's a lot of competition, a lot of brands, so you can find some really nice rods and pistons that are forged for pretty nice prices. When it comes to the stock crank, that thing is a Hulk. That thing, 700 horsepower, 800 horsepower builds with a stock crank, there's dozens upon dozens of them. You want to get rid of the stock OEM Mitsubishi crank only when you start aiming for some totally insane high-end drag strip destroyer that's pushing out, I don't know, 1000 to 1500 horsepower on 80 to 100 psi of boost. I think that's where the stock crank needs to be replaced. So your stage 2 is gonna start right around above 500 horsepower, and this is when you need to take the engine out of the car. This is when you need to get a new turbo. This is when you need to get, you know, different cams. This is when you need to get different cam gears. This is when you need to get, I don't know, exhaust manifolds and so on and so forth, and things will get a little bit pricey at this point. But again, as I said, 4G63, amazing aftermarket, and you can build an amazing engine. If you want to rev your 4G63 really high, pretty often, then your hydraulic valve lifters on the 4G63 are gonna be in the way, and you want to go with a solid valve lifter setup. Remember those balancing shafts that the 4G63 has in the block that we talked about? Well, when you start tuning the 4G63, you might want to consider removing them. For a low horsepower street build, I say let the balancing shafts stay, keep them in there, and some mild tuning isn't gonna be an issue. Just be very careful with your oil changes and the oil you're using. People do complain about the balancing shafts, you know, failing and seizing and causing engine failure. That usually happens when people do not change their oil on time or when they use cheap, crappy oil. When you tune the engine is gonna be exposed to even more heat and even more stress. And of course, you're gonna want to change the oil sooner than what was specified in the factory service manual. So, oil change, do not skimp on that, please. If you want to go big horsepower, then the added weight and friction and everything else of the balancing shafts is going to be in the way, and you will want to get rid of them for high horsepower builds. Another thing Mitsubishi people can make use of to get even more torque out of the 4G63 is the 4G64 engine block. It's not gonna be a super easy bolt-on where you just slap on a 4G63 head onto a 4G64 block. There's gonna be some head degreeing and a bunch of other tiny little things required, but it's nothing major. And the 4G64 block is super readily available, so you can get extra displacement and extra torque for not so much money. Another thing that is often associated with the later generations of the 4G63 is something called crank walk.
From that one dance in the town, hold on.
No, that's not crank walk. Crank walk is movement of your crankshaft in your engine block along the horizontal plane. This happens due to premature wear of the thrust bearings of your crankshaft. And I think by now many people have realized that the internet is a magician at blowing stuff out of proportion, and the crank walk that happens on 2G, 4G63s isn't as often as people claim. It's, according to many resources, around 10 to 20% of the engines. It doesn't happen that often, and it happens due to lack of proper maintenance and a bunch of other things. So if you're worried about crank walk, take care of your engine, and your chances of getting crank walk are honestly pretty low. So that's pretty much it when it comes to the 4G63, and now it's time for some 4G63 rap. I'm a 4G63, and I got all your eyes on me. My iron is cast, down the drag strip a blast. You may think that you're fast, but I'm just gonna leave you in the past. Word. So that was the rap, and that's a wrap of this video as well. What do you think about the 4G63? Well, why do you like the 4G63? Down there below there's something the French call the comment section, and in the comment section you can tell me what engines we should be doing next as well. You can also tell me if I missed something or said something wrong. I'm human, flesh and bones, it can happen, although it does not happen often. Also, I started a Patreon. Give me your money. If you support me with $10 on Patreon, I'm gonna give you $1 worth of sticker. It's a good deal. Do it.